Welcome to the Justification podcast, where we talk about life, the philosophies around it, and how we can put these philosophies into action in order to better our lives. Whether you are seeking motivation, reflection, or simply a moment of pure literary delight, this podcast is going to be your gateway to an immersive experience of captivating storytelling. Welcome to episode 2 of the Justification podcast, where today we are going to be diving deep into the fascinating world of Buddhism. By the end of today's episode, you are going to have a clearer understanding of the philosophy behind Buddhism, as well as the essential teachings of the Buddha. We are also going to go into detail about the practices that Buddhist monks use in order to achieve liberation. And by the end of it, you'll hopefully have a different outlook on life as a whole. Now, without further ado, let's get right into this. Starting off with a brief introduction, Buddhism is one of the largest religions. In fact, it is practiced by 500 million people, which equates to roughly 7% of the world's population. It is based on the teachings of Siddhartha Gautama, who would later achieve the title of the Buddha, which is terminology for the awakened. Buddhism isn't new by any means. It originated in India, and its origins date back as far as 2,500 years ago. Now, before we get into the nitty-gritty, I would like to establish some of the Buddhists' I believe are essential. First and foremost, even though Buddhism is often referred to as a religion, followers of Buddhism don't acknowledge a supreme god or deity. They instead focus on achieving enlightenment, which is characterized by a state of inner peace and wisdom. When followers reach this spiritual echelon, they are said to have experienced nirvana. The path to enlightenment is attained by utilizing morality, meditation, and wisdom. Now, Buddhists often meditate because they believe it helps awaken truth. So, the Buddha's most important teachings, known as the Four Noble Truths, we're going to get into that later, are essential to understanding the religion. And last but not least, the religion's founder, the Buddha, is considered to be an extraordinary being, but not a god. The word Buddha in itself means enlightened. So, he's just an enlightened, extraordinary being, not a god to be worshipped. Now, for those of you who might not know, who is the Buddha? What was his name? How did he become the Buddha? And here I'm going to tell you a little story about the life of Siddhartha Gautama. Now, Siddhartha Gautama, who is going to later become the Buddha, was born in 520 BC to King Shuddhodana and Queen Mahamaya, a wealthy family in modern-day Nepal. When the king consulted his seer about the future of his son, he was told that Siddhartha is either going to be a powerful ruler like his father, or he is going to become a spiritual leader. The king didn't want his son to be a spiritual leader, so in an effort of molding him into a powerful ruler, the one that he wanted him to be, he hid suffering from Siddhartha, leading Siddhartha to live a privileged life where he lived in a fancy palace, he had the finest clothes, ate and drank whatever he pleased, and married a beautiful bride. His father went as far as to fire all the sick, ugly, and aging servants. Moreover, nobody could as little as speak to Siddhartha about any of life's miseries. However, Siddhartha felt a deep sense of dissatisfaction with his luxurious life. One day, Siddhartha went on a trip outside of the palace, and it was on that trip that he first saw signs of misery. He first saw an old man, then a sick man, then a corpse, and finally a monk who seemed to be at peace despite having practically nothing to his name. Siddhartha admired that man and decided that he wanted to become a monk as well. He wanted to find an answer to life's suffering, so he learned from great yoga and meditation masters. He even went as far as to join a group of holy men in the forest who practiced extreme fasting and intense meditation. However, after practically starving himself, Siddhartha had become no more than a living skeleton. He realized that he was getting nowhere with approaching life from this extreme. The hunger started to get him clouding his thoughts. He wasn't any closer to an answer of suffering. In fact, he was further from an answer to suffering than he was when he started. Having experienced both extremes in life, he realized that the path to enlightenment, the answer to suffering, lies somewhere in between the luxurious life of a prince and a hermit's life of starvation. Thus, he had to find a middle way. Having eaten and regained his energy, Siddhartha approached a tree that will be later known as the Bodhi tree and vowed to meditate under it until he found an answer to life's suffering. During his meditation, he realized that we only suffer because we want things to be a certain way. So by eliminating desires and accepting things as they are, we could put an end to suffering. He realized that things are constantly changing, and the only thing that he could do was accept those changes. Eventually, freed from desire, his senses were purified and he had a sense of joy and compassion for everything on earth, Under that tree, Siddhartha had achieved nirvana or enlightenment and he became the Buddha. In order to help others achieve nirvana, he laid out a path for everyone to follow. First and foremost, the Four Noble Truths. Now, the Four Noble Truths are practically the basics of Buddhism, also referred to as the truths of the spiritually worthy ones. Starting off, life is suffering. As dark as this may sound, I assure you it is actually not. Here's the idea. Life is actually dukkha, which normally translates to suffering in English, even though they use the term suffering. I believe that term dissatisfaction fits it better. You'll see why. We are constantly dissatisfied because we cling to temporary things like good health, good looks, and even friendships. He says life is dukkha, full of unpleasant experiences. For example, losing your keys is dukkha, but losing a loved one is also dukkha. Regretting what you ate for lunch is dukkha, but also regretting, I don't know, 30 years of bad marriage is also dukkha. You see, the suffering of encountering what is unpleasant and the suffering of separation from what is pleasant cannot be necessarily called suffering because of how minor it is. It is more of a dissatisfaction. Suffering is a really strong word to describe suffering from what's unpleasant or detachment from what is pleasant. That's not suffering, that's just dissatisfactory and it is uncomparable to actual suffering. For example, suffering from an illness. I'll give you one more example just so that we are very clear. For example, getting cold food delivered to your home is dukkha, but suffering from illness is also dukkha. One is not as extreme as the other. You don't necessarily suffer because you got cold food. However, you are dissatisfied with the service. With illness, you are literally suffering because of your illness and you are dissatisfied. So the common denominator here is dissatisfaction. However, for many, you might be wondering, what about the good things in life? Pleasure, achievement, these are good feelings. Not everything has to be black and white. Not everything has to be suffering or not suffering. Now, you see, the first noble truth is actually a lot darker than you'd think. Not only is there unhappiness in life, but even what we believe is happiness is only a delayed form of unhappiness. For example, pleasure is only the mask of pain. Achievement is the mask of disappointment. That is called implicit suffering. The Buddha spoke of the truth of suffering in three phases. So, in the first phase, he describes suffering, that there is this truth of suffering. The world is suffering. In the second phase, we must understand what suffering is, notice suffering when it's there, and the different kinds of suffering there are, how it operates and affects us in our daily lives. In the third phase, when it is internalized, when the spiritual seeker comes into contact with what is called samsara, samsara is basically the terminology used to refer to the never ending cycle of death and rebirth. We'll get into that later. They know the nature of samsara is suffering, implicitly so or explicitly so. There is suffering literally everywhere. So, in case you're not caught up, it does get pretty confusing. In the first phase, there's just the truth of suffering. It is described. In the second phase, the types of suffering are described. Yes, suffering does have types, and we're going to go over them in a bit. And third, we internalize it. We know that we are leading a life full of suffering. We just accept it. Getting into the types of suffering. First, you have what is called dukkha dukkha, which is the suffering of suffering. This refers to the physical and emotional discomfort and pain all humans and animals, even down to insects and plants, experience this said discomfort. Granted, plants and animals mostly experience physical pain, unlike us, we have emotional pain, anxiety, depression, fear, and so on. At this level of suffering, there are mundane cures. Mundane suffering requires mundane cures. For example, if we are bored, there are various sources of entertainment available, YouTube, TV, Netflix. If we encounter illness, we have medicine. If we are hungry, there is food, and so on. However, none of those cures are permanent. If you eat, for example, a couple of hours later, you'll be hungry again. If you binge watching YouTube videos for 3 hours, a couple of hours later, if you have no entertainment, you will be bored again. So you see, these solutions may cure part of one thing in our lives, but there are still other sufferings, so to speak, and they're reoccurring. So if you get rid of one, the other arises. Then you have the parinama dukkha, which is the suffering of change. This refers to the suffering that arises from the inability to accept change. We want pleasure. We seek it through people, objects, activities, and gadgets. These things at the time look very attractive to us, and we believe that they will give us happiness. How often do you hear, if only I had X, Y, Z, I would be happy? When we do attain these pleasurable things, they do give us some sort of happiness for a short while. And that which was attractive to us, it was shiny, irreplaceable, new, it changes, it becomes ugly. This person, for example, isn't as good as I thought he or she was. This phone now is outdated and there's a better, shinier, more attractive phone on the market. The Buddhists have come to the realization that everything is interdependent. Nothing exists by its own self, and everything is powered by another thing. Every entity is under the power of other things for its birth, existence, and even for its decay and death. Every entity is at the power of another thing. So, as these underlying factors change, the entity itself is going to change too. Being interdependent means that we are subject to continuous change. The world is constantly changing. We seem to want things to stay the same, but we cling to pleasurable experiences and we feel sad when they pass. We cannot accept the truth of impermanence. However, as backwards as this may sound at first, change itself is not the cause of suffering here. It is actually our approach to change that needs to change. Let's take a look at someone who is enlightened, for example, let's say the Buddha. Even his most devout followers, who all live in the same changing world, environment, body, and mind, who all have claimed that they have gone beyond suffering. Let's take his devout followers as well. It is our approach where we grasp changing objects thinking that they are not going to change. They are going to remain sources of joy for us forever, which sounds very absurd and very illogical when we say it at first, but that's simply how we behave. And lastly, we have Sankara Dukkha, which is the suffering of existence. Now, basically, this could be described as background suffering. It is the profound unsatisfactoriness of existence, which is caused by simply existing. We have this body mind. We identify ourselves as this body mind. Now, it is important to note that the terms body mind are used as a short for the five aggregates. That is a terminology in Buddhist books. We're going to get into them. The first one is called Rupa Skandha, which refers to the physical body, and the next four are mental, hence why the terminology is body mind. First physical, then the four are mental. So the physical body is the first aggregate. Then there is something called Vedana, which means sensations. That refers to the sensations we are having all the time, pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral. Then we have something called Sangya, which refers to perception, what we label everything around us, cup, tea, table, grass, sun. Then we also have Samskara Skandha, which refers to our personality, memories, tendencies, and desires. It's like all of these conceptions, it's like the mental baggage of our past karma, which we're going to get into that later, that every one of us carries around. And lastly, we have Vajnana, which is the consciousness, the awareness itself. So these are the five aggregates, very briefly. And as you can see, the first one is physical, thus body, and the other four are mental, hence mind. So the attachment and identification of ourselves as this body mind leads to pervasive suffering. As long as we see ourselves as a self in this body mind, we are subject to endless suffering. However, body mind is not the source of suffering either, even though it leads to it, because the Buddha himself still had body mind after he had attained enlightenment. He was still attached to body mind. It is only in our unenlightened state where body mind proves to be the source of suffering. After enlightenment, the body mind won't be a problem to the same being, therefore making ignorance the actual cause of suffering. The Buddhists say we must admit that we are unenlightened and follow the Buddhist path. In an unenlightened state, the body and mind itself becomes the source of the suffering. And since we are with the body and mind all of the time, everything in our lives becomes infected with suffering. Okay, so about 500 years ago, there lived a Tibetan master by the name of Tsongkhapa. He analyzed suffering and reached the conclusion that there are 8 types of suffering. So, you have the suffering of old age, the suffering of birth, the suffering of death, suffering of disease, suffering from coming into contact with what is unpleasant, the severance of contact with what is pleasant, then you have the suffering of desires not being fulfilled, and then you have the suffering that comes from ignorance and from being attached to the body mind. Now, the Buddhists have a very impressive way of analyzing information. I'm saying that because they managed to compress the first 4 types of suffering into two, which are coming into contact with what is unpleasant, so old age, disease, just to name a few. Then you have loss of contact with what is pleasant, youth, energy, going from a good healthy body to an old brittle one, even losing money. Moreover, these 2 types of suffering can be further compressed into one, which is just desires not being satisfied. If you think about it, For everything we do, you have expectations of how the thing is going to turn out. And hey, sometimes you might be right to expect a certain desired outcome, but it doesn't get fulfilled. Therefore, we become unhappy. In other words, all suffering comes from our desires not being fulfilled. My desires not being fulfilled leave me frustrated. Therefore, I suffer. There is this quote by the Buddha, which I would really like to get into, which is pain is inevitable, but suffering is optional. Everywhere you look, is dukkha. You'll see some dissatisfaction with everything, and for many, they would feel the sense of nihilism, the sense of nothing really matters, so I try anyways. They become active nihilists, succumbing to the despairs of life, thinking of ending it all right there and then, and sadly taking away their own lives. But according to the Buddha, rebirth is a thing, and so is karma. So taking one's own life as an act of violence and rejection is only going to result in you being rebirthed into a worse life than you are currently in. A life where dukkha is even more intense. So trapped in this endless cycle of dukkha, what do we do to improve our situation? Here is where the second noble truth comes into play. It is important to understand that thirst is the origin of dukkha. Let's consider some scenarios that bring us dissatisfaction. Bad experiences, no matter how small or big. These experiences can range from a car accident to failing an exam or losing a video game or even dropping a glass of water. These experiences are enormously different, but they have one thing in common. You wanted a completely different experience. You wanted your experience to be different than what it actually was. This is what I am referring to when I say thirst. Now, thirst is the origin of dukkha. Thirst is the fundamental desire for your experience to be different than it actually is. Now, you're probably wondering, if I thirst for the right things, then I must be able to avoid dukkha, right? I mean, I'm thirsting for the right things. These things are going to bring me happiness and they're going to help me avoid suffering. However, you're missing a lot of vital points here. First of all, you are hanging on to what is impermanent, which we just discussed. It is not going to stay like that. It's not going to be as you expect it. It might actually be worse. However, it is not the thirst for the bad things that create dukkha. It is in fact the thirst itself that brings dukkha. Everybody thirsts for something. A monk, let's take a monk, one of the most disciplined people you could imagine. He thirsts for spiritual enlightenment. A student for good grades, a businessman for more money. However, even though they thirst for the quote good things in life, they are still victims of dukkha, because you see, thirst is always the origin of dukkha. Whatever we thirst for is going to bring us dukkha because we don't have it. Let's say, for example, I thirst for a new keyboard. I am in immediate dukkha because I'm like, oh, I want this keyboard. I don't have this keyboard. If I have it, I'm going to not be in dukkha. However, if I don't have it, then I will be in dukkha. That's first. Second, we thirst because of pleasant and unpleasant experiences. We like pleasant things and we want to repeat, and we dislike for the unpleasant experiences. Even when we do get what we want, it is never as good as we imagined it to be. But let's just say it is. What if it is? You never know. Even then, hey, let's assume that it's better than we imagined. Let's glorify this better than we imagined. There's still a problem though. It never lasts. Every desire leads to the same destination, dukkha, and it doesn't even stop there. When we do eventually arrive at dukkha, to the same destination, dukkha, and it doesn't even stop there. When we do eventually arrive at dukkha and our desires bring us dissatisfaction, we don't just simply let them go as we know they are going to lead us to dissatisfaction. We do quite the opposite, actually. We believe that desiring and attaining yet other things is going to bring us lasting happiness, but that never happens because we never get the eternal happiness we so desire. And that is how thirst leads to addiction. The Buddhists believe that suffering comes from the attachment to three desires. First one being the desire for the sense of pleasure, i.e., instant gratification. We want it, but we know it's bad for us. Example of this includes eating junk food, binging movies, and everything that gives us pleasure right now. And that also sacrifices something from our future selves. In the example of eating junk food, for example, you are taking a nice body away from yourself. Then we have the desire to become, which is the desire to become something more than you are right now. something brilliant like the desire of becoming a millionaire or an astronaut or a doctor. Simply put, it's the desire to become something brilliant and live as that extraordinary being you so desperately wish to become. Lastly, we have the desire to get rid of. For example, the desire to get rid of negative emotions, the desire to get rid of temptations, the desire to get rid of laziness. The list goes on and on and on. Now, every desire comes with the promise of a better, more fulfilling life. I saw this comparison while I was doing my research and I couldn't help but include it. So here goes. Desire is like the mythical creature Hydra. Cut one of its heads off and two more will spring into its place. Every desire is fuel for more desire. Let's say I want a good grade. Okay, I got a good grade. I'm still not satisfied because, hey, it did bring me momentary satisfactoriness, but I'm now not satisfied. I'm used to getting the good grade. Now I want something else. Even though the desire does lead to dukkha, the Buddha still distinguishes some desires better than others. For example, the desire to become better, a more responsible person, is better than the desire for alcohol, sex, or drugs. However, as one walks down the path of spiritual awakening, he or she must learn to detach himself from the spiritual ambitions. The Buddha has designed his teachings in a way that you'll have to go through the hardships and practice to learn what he's preaching, then you'll have to get rid of it entirely and detach yourself from it. The Buddha explains this in his famous simile of the raft. He describes his teaching as a raft for you to use to cross a dangerous river. It'll save you from a lot of suffering, but once you reach the shore, do you take the raft and carry it with you? Of course not. Once you're advanced enough, it'll only hinder your progress, and if you carry it around, or in this case remain attached to techniques and practices, even those taught by the Buddha himself, they will hinder you. So the first noble truth gives us the symptom, dukkha, what we suffer from. It introduces us to dukkha and what it actually is, where we can find it, and it just tells us that, hey, everything is suffering, even good things. They're just not suffering right now, they're going to become suffering later on. The second noble truth gives us the disease we all suffer from, which is thirst. We thirst for something, we don't get it, we suffer. And even then, when we do get it, it is not as good as we expect it to be, so we suffer. So the third noble truth is going to give us the cure. The third noble truth is the claim that one can bring dukkha to a complete end, forever. It comes from the Buddha's direct experience of awakening under the Bodhi tree. He saw a world that has no dukkha, no suffering, no thirst. It's a perfect reality that is present everywhere and all the time if we have the eyes to see it. He called this perfect reality nirvana. Now, you have probably heard this term a lot in Buddhism. Nirvana is impossible to explain in words. Words that we use to communicate with each other cannot describe nirvana. They can only circle around, they can only beat around the bush. Explaining nirvana to someone who has not experienced it would be the equivalent of trying to explain what color is to a bunch of colorblind people. You will either convince them that you are a madman or a great mystic. The literal word nirvana means to blow out, to extinguish. It is very misleading to say that the Buddha has attained nirvana because nirvana is not a state or something to be attained, it is a transition. So when the Buddha, quote, attained nirvana, he extinguished himself. More precisely, he extinguished the thirst within him, the thirst based on ignorance that is overcome by wisdom. It is the detachment from everything, just plainly existing. It is a separation from all likes, dislikes, hatred, greed, and delusion. Nirvana is the end of desire. It is a state where the flames of desire have been extinguished. When you say you desire nirvana, you are desiring a false idea in your head of what nirvana is. In order to end dukkha, you must even eliminate the desire to end dukkha. That's how crazy it gets. Nirvana gets more and more complicated from here, and I'd like to point out that nirvana is also referred to as the ultimate state of happiness that comes when we are liberated from finding pleasure or pain in impermanent temporary objects. Now, in the words of Alan Watts, wisdom must come from the abandonment of selfish cravings. One who abandons that desire achieves nirvana. The third noble truth teaches us that it is possible to overcome the cycle of suffering by letting go of attachment and craving. This can be achieved through the practice of mindfulness, meditation, and developing wisdom and insight into the nature of reality. By cultivating an understanding that everything in life is impermanent and constantly changing, and that clinging to things will only lead us to suffering, individuals can attain freedom from this cycle. The end of suffering is not just a temporary relief or a state of pleasurable experiences. Instead, it is a profound and lasting transformation of the mind and perception, bringing about a sense of inner peace, contentment, and liberation. This state is often referred to as nirvana in Buddhism. It is important to note that nirvana is not something that can be accurately described or understood intellectually. It is a direct experience that goes beyond words or concepts. Last but not least, we have the fourth noble truth. Now, the fourth noble truth is not necessarily one truth, like life is suffering or thirst is the origin of suffering. Rather, it is eight necessary principles in one's life if one wishes to lead a happy life and just end the cycle of suffering. It is called the Eightfold Path. So, first you have right view, which means understanding the true nature of reality, including the impermanence of all things and the interconnectedness of everything. Everything always changes. Everything is temporary, yet everything is interconnected. All of our actions have an effect on other lives and vice versa, which is also interestingly where their concept of karma comes from, good karma and bad karma. Then you have right intention, which is developing intentions of kindness, compassion, and non harm towards oneself and others. If you don't intend on harming anyone, you are compassionate towards other people, you are a peaceful being. Right speech, practicing honest, kind, and beneficial speech, thus avoiding lying, gossip, harsh words, especially curse words, and divisive speech. Moving on, we have right action, which is living ethically and avoiding actions that harm oneself and others, such as stealing, killing, and sexual misconduct. Then we have right livelihood, which is engaging in a livelihood that is honest, ethical, and does not harm others. It is a way to earn a living that does not harm others or one's self. In defining right livelihood, the Buddha named five types of businesses that people should not engage in. These were dealing, weapons, trade of human beings, including slavery, and prostitution. Then you have right effort, which is cultivating energy and determination to overcome negative qualities and develop positive ones. This would include trying to abandon wrong speech and to enter into right speech, trying to abandon wrong action and entering into right action. Moving on, we have right mindfulness, which is being fully present and aware of our thoughts, feelings, and actions in each moment, observing them without judgment. In other words, it is the development of an accurate and precise awareness of the present moment, uncolored by ideas, memories, beliefs, expectations, etc. Just experience it as it is. Then, last but not least, we have right concentration, which is cultivating deep states of focused and tranquil meditation to develop clarity, insight, and wisdom. This essentially boils down to the ability to focus steadily one's mind on any one object and one only to the exclusion of all others. Think of a camera when it focuses on, let's say, a cup and everything around it becomes blurry. Examples of this would include focusing on your breath only or focusing on only the person you're talking to. By following the Eightfold Path, individuals can cultivate wisdom, ethical behavior, and mental discipline. This path leads to the cessation of suffering and attaining enlightenment or nirvana, a state of profound peace, freedom, and liberation beyond suffering. Now, a lot of you might go, I'm in too deep. There's practically no hope for me in attaining this lifestyle because I'm addicted to porn, drugs, alcohol, social media, etc. In response, I would like to share a story with you. It is the story of Ankurimara. This story isn't only going to give you hope of following this path, but it's also going to show you that literally anyone, quite literally anybody, no matter their age or what they've done, they can become a sage, peaceful, and free of suffering. They can end the cycle of suffering. So the story goes like this. There was a Brahmin named Badagav. One night his wife gave birth to a son. However, that night all weapons and armor in the city began to glow red. That night the king was sleeping and his weapons too began to glow red. He was terrified and he cried out. When his advisor came to check on him, he explained to the confused and scared king that this is happening all over the city. The stars had even formed what a wise man would call the robber's constellation, which means that anyone born on that night was going to become a violent criminal and commit heinous crimes. Now, the advisor, who is the Brahmin, confessed to the king about his son being born that night, and the following day he brought him over to the king for execution. The king looked at the baby and decided that he cannot execute a baby based on a prophecy that just doesn't make sense. He told the advisor to raise the baby well, teach him morality, and hope that the prophecy just does not come true. But he's not going to execute him. That just doesn't make any sense. The boy was named Ahimsaka, which means he who does not harm others, and he grew up to be strong and was well liked by others. He prayed to the gods, was kind to animals, and focused on his studies. Ahimsaka was physically superior to his peers in every way. He also practiced humility and spent much of his time caring for his teacher, which led him to be the most favored student of the famous school's teacher. Despite almost everyone being in awe of Ahimsaka, many others were envious of him and devised a plan to take care of Ahimsaka for good. So what they did was actually pretty clever. I'm not gonna lie, I'll give them that. Some part of the jealous students went to the teacher with the claim that they heard rumors about Ahimsaka planning on killing the teacher with the intention of taking over and becoming the new teacher. The teacher, being wise, brushed them off as rumors. Not too long after that, another part of the jealous students sought to convince the teacher of the same rumors. The teacher brushed off this part as well, but began to wonder if there's any truth in what they're saying. Not too long after that, another set of jealous students came to report that they too have heard these exact rumors. That teacher tried to brush them off but was very troubled. They got into his head. He thought, if all of these people heard the same thing, then the rumors must be true. It's illogical that this number of people can be wrong about the same exact thing. He thought the truth was obvious. Ansaka was working so hard because he wanted to kill the teacher and take over his school. He wanted to do something before it was too late. So he summoned Ahamsaka. The teacher said that Ahamsaka's training as a true Brahmin is almost complete, but he must provide the traditional final gift offered to a teacher, then he will grant his approval. The teacher demands 1,000 fingers, each taken from a different human being. Now, the plan in the teacher's head was Ahimsaka is going to be killed in the course of seeking this prize. Ahimsaka thought, if I'm going to kill a lot of people, I might as well target the bad ones instead of the innocent ones. He began seeking out bandits and criminals. He mercilessly slayed every single one he encountered, and none of them stood a chance against him. After his first kill, however, he was shaken as he had never intentionally harmed anyone, let alone taken a life. After meditating and regaining his composure, he saw that the only way to move forward was to just complete the quest. So he viciously targeted bandits, criminals, thieves, rapists, and murderers. No matter how large their numbers were, they never stood a chance against him. He cut off their thumbs and added them to his collection. Now the blood was dripping and the rotten flesh began to smell, so he hung out the thumbs like you do with laundry, and he let the animals, like the little birds, pick all the meat off the bones in order not to lose them. However, he made a necklace of the bones and he wore this necklace around his neck at all times. When the forests were clear of bandits and criminals, Ahimsaka began targeting anyone who was in his path. He would usually hide in the trees and wait for people just to appear so that he could kill them. However, Ankarimara, which is what he would later be called, did not stop there. He began targeting nearby villages and committing mass murders just for some fingers. Words of his mass murders quickly made their way to the king, who started preparing for a hunt, the hunt for Ankarimara. Meanwhile, Ankarimara's parents heard about the news that the king is hunting an outlaw, and since Ankarimara was born with bad omens, they concluded it must be him. Although the father prefers not to interfere, the mother disagrees. Fearing for her son's life, she sets out to find her son and to warn him of the king's intent and take care of him. Now, cut to the Buddha. The Buddha perceives through meditative vision that Ankarimara has slain 999 victims and is desperately seeking the last one. If the Buddha is to encounter Ankarimara that day, the latter will become a monk and subsequently attain abhinna, which is nirvana. However, if Ankarimara is to kill his own mother instead, she will be his thousandth victim and he will be unsavable, since in Buddhism it is considered one of the five worst actions a person can commit. The five actions, very briefly, are intentionally killing one's mother, intentionally killing one's father, killing an arahan, who is basically someone who has achieved enlightenment and gained insight into the true nature of existence, causing a schism within the community of monks and nuns, and lastly, shedding the blood of a Buddha. Upon committing one of these actions, one will be sent to the lowest part of hell and is going to endure unspeakable torment and pain, only to be reborn into the same place and forced to experience it over again. The Buddha sets off to intercept Ankaramara despite being warned by local villagers not to go. On the road through the forest, Ankaramara first sees his mother. Now, according to some versions of the story, he then has a moment of reconciliation with her and her providing food for him. After some deliberation, however, he decides to make her his thousandth victim. But when the Buddha also arrives, he chooses to kill him instead, because you're either going to kill a Buddha or you're going to kill your own mother. He draws his sword and starts running towards the Buddha. But although Ankaramara is running as fast as he cannot catch up with the Buddha, who is simply walking calmly too. The Buddha is using some supernatural accomplishment that affects Ankaramara. The Buddha, through these powers, contracts and expands the earth on which they stand, thus keeping a distance of Ankaramara. This bewilders Ankaramara so much that he calls the Buddha stop. Side note, for anyone curious about these so-called powers, there are 8 of them. When one attains them, he or she gains the ability to replicate and project bodily images of oneself, make oneself invisible, pass through solid objects, walking through walls, practically hacks, sink into the solid ground, walk on water, fly, touch the sun and moon with one's hand, and ascend to the world of the god Brahma in the highest heavens. Okay, now that we have that out of the way, the Buddha then says that he himself has already stopped and that Ankaramara is the one who should stop. The Buddha had already stopped. He stopped killing and harming others and himself. He had stopped creating karma, which creates a karmic contract, which he must be reborn in suffering states to fulfill. Now it was time for him, Ankaramara, to do likewise. Ankaramara was so struck by these words that there and then he stopped. He threw away his weapons along with his necklace of 999 fingers, mind you, and followed the Buddha back to the monastery where he became a monk. Meanwhile, the king sets out to kill Ankaramara. He stops first, though, to pay a visit to the Buddha and his followers at the monastery to gain their blessing. He explains to the Buddha his purpose, and the Buddha asks how the king will respond if he were to discover that Ankaramara had given up the life of a highwayman and become a monk. Now, the king says that he would salute him and offer to provide for him and his monastic vocation. The Buddha then reveals that Ankaramara is sitting only a few feet away, his hair and beard shaven off, a member of the Buddhist order. The king is astounded but also delighted. He addresses his hair and beard shaven off, a member of the Buddhist order. The king is astounded but also delighted. He addresses Ankaramara and offers to donate robe materials to Ankaramara. However, Ankaramara does not accept the gift because of an ascetic training he observes. He chose to wear the same robe every day and to only eat what he collects from his alms round. In the end, the king chooses not to persecute Ankaramara. Happy ending, right? No. Even though the king has chosen not to persecute Ankaramara, the villagers were not fond of him. Ankaramara went hungry on most days and was beaten a lot by the villagers. We can't blame the villagers though. This story really tries to make the villagers look bad because they beat Ankaramara and they mistreat him basically after he changes his ways. However, I do not blame the villagers because even though Ankaramara has changed his ways, he still took the lives of mothers, fathers, brothers, sisters, friends, and many more. So imagine just seeing the person who mercilessly murdered your friends and family. It would not be pleasant. Now, as a result, he was beaten a lot and went hungry most days. However, he knew that he was going through something that was a small price to pay for what he has done. One day later, Ankaramara comes across a young woman undergoing difficult labor during childbirth. Ankaramara goes to the Buddha. He asks him what he can do to ease his pain. The Buddha says, "Tell her, sister, since I have been born, I have never intentionally taken a life. By this truth, may you and your infant be safe." Ankaramara points out that it would be untrue for him to say that because he took the lives of many. He cannot willingly and so shamelessly lie. To which the Buddha responds with, "Say to her, sister, since I was born into the noble birth, I have never intentionally taken a life. By that truth, may you and your infant be safe." Ankaramara went to visit the woman. The people there put up curtains in the room and prepared a seat for Ankaramara. Ankaramara sat down, concentrated his mind, and made the assertion of truth as the Buddha told him. Strangely enough, after making his assertion of truth, the woman did not feel any pain and gave birth to a child with no pain whatsoever. Everyone was astounded. This monk, with his assertion of truth, had caused a difficult labor to be safe and easy. I want that. Despite performing miracles, Ankaramara still got beat up by vengeful people, and he went to the Buddha and said, "This path of good is not easy. Just receiving the karmic results of my past actions is so difficult to bear." The Buddha replied with, "Bear it, bear it. You have experienced the here and now. Past karma usually ripens quicker in this lifetime. The ripening of your karma, which you might have experienced over a year, many centuries, or many millennia, when one strives for final liberation in a lifetime, past karmas usually ripen quicker in this lifetime. Bear it, for we have already created the causes. Therefore, the results are unavoidable. Use this time you have left in this life to achieve full liberation. Do not focus on that which is unavoidable, for that would waste your time. Focus on what you can achieve and go forth with all your might and achieve it." Ankaramara reflected on what the Buddha told him. He reflected on the suffering that is inherent to life. Is happiness worth it? How much happiness does one need to experience to make suffering over a multitude of lifetimes worth it? After asking himself this series of questions, Ankaramara came to the conclusion that nothing is permanent in this life, so happiness won't last forever. However, the results of our actions stay with us until they are paid. Life is an unending cycle of suffering, and Ankaramara recalled all the suffering he has been through, the suffering he has caused others to endure. His mind, after being shown the countless traumatic experiences of suffering, released all attachments, and nothing could ever convince him to be reborn ever again. Right there and then, Ankaramara attained full enlightenment and achieved total liberation. Ankaramara has discovered something that binds us to life, something that we want to reborn for. The Buddhists have actually identified what binds us to samsara. It's not a list of things as you think. It is actually way more interesting than that. They believe there are these sort of chains binding us to samsara, which is the cycle of life and death, thus endless suffering. They call it the 12 link chain. Now, this is actually very interesting, and if you're going to take anything away from this episode, please take this, because this actually blew my mind when I first saw it. Okay, so it's like a chain, so it's all connected. Okay, number one on our chain is ignorance. Our ignorance leads to desire, which leads to action, which is based on ignorance. So we react with ignorance because of our ignorance. This is why we kill each other, we have depression and jealousy and commit sexual misconduct. We are reacting to our own ignorance. In other words, our ignorance misleads us to commit the wrong deeds. Now, the beautiful thing about this is that it is all connected. Ignorance now becomes the condition, like the little base for the second link, which is called mental formation, otherwise known as reaction. Now, mental formation refers to the habits or impressions we have consciously formed. Mental formations are formed by repeated actions, thus making them habits in the same way a river is formed by repeated flows through the same stream. In the same way, our actions and reactions to certain situations become habitual despite it being good or bad. We just do it without thinking twice because that's how we have always done it. For example, killing animals for food and protecting our egos. These habits become a part of our personality and we take them with us in the form of habitual energy. Now, because it's all connected, depending on ignorance, a reaction arises. Most of this reaction is non-virtuous. Granted, sometimes we perform virtuous actions, non-evil actions. However, we have performed them in order to get a good result. So we do the good deeds with attachments, which is impure. Now, mental formation becomes a condition for consciousness. So because of ignorance, we perform actions that generate bad karmic energy. And according to the Buddhists, when we die, consciousness wouldn't just die. It won't just go away. I mean, technically it will. It will go on to the next life. There is something called the eight consciousnesses, and I'd like to go ahead and list them pretty quickly. So, first of all, we have sight consciousness, hearing consciousness, smell, taste, touch. Then we have mind consciousness, mano consciousness, which is the consciousness that's responsible for our abstract thoughts and exploring the inner world. And then we have alaya consciousness, which is the storehouse consciousness. So all of our mental formations, our reactions, and karmic energy are just stored in there. Most of us have a polluted alaya consciousness because of ignorance. We perform all of these bad deeds, creating bad energy. And according to these Buddhists, all of the karmic energy generated by others' bad deeds are going to be stored in our consciousness. And when our body dies, we reincarnate with our consciousness into the next life. The Buddhists are really big on reincarnation. So, to sum up so far, because it does get really confusing, the first three are general basics of the 12 link chain. Because of ignorance, we perform all of these reactions, these mental formations, these bad deeds. Then, because of the existence of karmic energy, we have suffering. Then, we store all of this bad karmic energy into our consciousness. When our body dies, it does not all just disappear. We carry what we have stored into our consciousness into the next life with our polluted alaya consciousness. Nothing disappears. It all moves on to the next life. Now, consciousness leaves the body last. When you eventually die, all of your senses are gone. The meat on your body is going to rot and everything just leaves, including the consciousness, but it does so after everything has left your body. So it's the last thing to leave. Then, when you reincarnate, when your parents do the you know what, your consciousness is the first thing to enter your mother's body. It is like a body in an ovary form, in a minute form. So when your consciousness enters your mother's body, the mind and the body are already formed in the mother's body. So because of this consciousness entering, the mind and body are formed, otherwise known as name and form. So the name and form are practically you reincarnating and thinking that everything that happened in your past life has nothing to do with you now. It's in the past, it's in the past, but that's not true in this case. Not realizing that you carry a lot of bad karma as a result from your mental formations / bad deeds that you committed because of your ignorance. Then the mind and body become the condition for what is called the sixth sense. So, of course, we have taste, smell, see, hear, touch. However, according to Buddhism, we have a sixth sense, which is the mind. So, these six senses are created inside of the mother's body. When the sperm and ovary do their thing, a baby is formed. A little nose appears, then eyes, then in other terms, we get our senses back. So the mind and body are the condition for the six senses, of which we will use to explore the world in the future, committing bad deeds based on ignorance. The six senses are the basis for the next component, which is contact. Our senses allow us to make contact with the world, and as far as my research goes, that's all there is to it. Then this contact acts as a condition for feeling. Now, depending on contact, feeling arises. This contact has two facets. There's an internal contact. The baby in there has contact with the mother, physically and mentally. When the mother is feeling happy, he's happy. When she's feeling sad, he's sad. When she's always angry, the baby gets habituated to throw tantrums. So you see, we start learning when the six senses start. Education doesn't wait until the baby comes out. The baby learns through his mother's own mental formations. The mother has so much effect on the baby to the point where if the mother drinks something cold, the baby is going to feel cold, and if she drinks something hot, the baby is going to feel hot. That is internal contact. When the baby is born, he's going to have direct contact with the environment. He's going to have feelings of his own. When the baby is happy, he'll smile. When he's sad, he's going to cry. This leads us to the next component of the chain, which is feeling. What do we mean when we say feelings? It's so broad. There are many feelings: anger, sadness, happiness. The list is inexhaustible, but it usually boils down to pleasant and unpleasant or neutral. Depending on the feeling, craving arises, which is the seventh component. Back to the example of the baby craves milk for good food. Now, when the baby becomes a toddler, teenager, adult, and even old, he or she will always be craving something. If it's not milk as a baby, it's going to be that of a new toy in the market as a toddler. Depending on the craving, clinging arises, which is the eighth component. We cling onto things and we attach to fame, wealth, good food, good friendships. Saying that we don't have cravings is lying to oneself. If it's not we want it or we don't, we all have such cravings. Now, what differs is the degree that we have them to. Clinging becomes the attachment for becoming. Becoming is the actions that we would perform in this life, the habits that develop over countless lifetimes, thus building up bad karmic energy. Combined with new actions performed in this life, we have bad karmic energy as a result. We have reincarnation. Becoming becomes the condition for birth. Pretty self-explanatory. You are just born and you physically manifest into the world. You are taken out of your mother's womb. Then birth becomes the condition for aging and death, where you are born and doomed to age and die. Everyone has to die. Everybody has to age. You get to die because you were born. Now, depending on aging and death, guess what arises? Ignorance. In our past lives, we didn't know how to meditate, we were egotistical, we were built up all that negative karmic energy, we are always involved with ignorance, and at least we were in our past lives. Because of ignorance, mental formations arise, then we consciousness arises, then it becomes a never-ending chain. We have been living all of this in a loop without even knowing about it across multiple lives too. The life that we lead is full of suffering. In order to eliminate suffering, we have to get rid of the base of the chain, which is ignorance. Once we eradicate ignorance, everything else falls apart. Mental formation is based on ignorance, so it collapses, followed by consciousness, which is based on mental formation. Since mental formation collapsed, consciousness is going to collapse, and so on. We are essentially trapped in this cycle until we learn how to break free of the 12-link chain. By eliminating ignorance, all else is eliminated because they all rely on each other. Now, you might be wondering, how do we do that? Well, sadly, we can't fully eliminate it. However, we can escape it through first reading. Try to read quality literature, but any reading is great, if not for any other reason, because it lets you see what works and what doesn't in writing and society alike. Challenge your own preconceptions. Not everything you know is true or makes sense if you really think about it. One very common misconception, for example, is one revolving around the ego. At least for me, why prove yourself to other people and keep up, quote, dignity and, quote, respect from others? You don't even control that. So try to control it is like wishing for something to be something else completely. You'll suffer because you try to control other people's perceptions of you, which is very obviously out of your control. Now, beyond preconceptions, don't be afraid to ask the difficult what if questions, because these are the questions that usually lead you to the answer that you are afraid of hearing, but the one that you really need to hear in order to move on effectively. You can also meditate. It is one of the practices that Buddhists use to lead a peaceful and fulfilling life. I would like to delve deeper into the practices that Buddhists use. Generally, Buddhists use two practices, chanting and meditation. We're going to be discussing each one in detail, starting with meditation. We know why Buddhists meditate. That would lead to a peaceful and fulfilling life and eventually attain enlightenment. However, we don't really know how Buddhist meditation works, so what do? Buddhist meditation is generally taking a simple object, often the breath or anything, and you offer techniques to practice mindfulness and arouse awareness with it. So basically, all of your attention is placed on your breath. The entire outside world becomes closed and you can only look within. Sure, you can hear sounds, feel feelings, and even get urges. However, when you focus on the breath, everything around you just sort of fades away and you separate yourself from your thoughts, thus becoming fully aware in the present moment, just enjoying it without the weight of worries and problems that often end up solving themselves. This brings peace and ease with the way that the breath rises and falls. If we feel some stillness in the breath, we can feel the peaceful and unity. We can feel peaceful and unified during the day too. It is important to note that meditation does not always have a religious element. It is a natural part of the human experience and is increasingly used as a therapy for promoting good health and boosting the immune system. So whether you wish to become a Buddhist monk or follow this path to the end, or just wish to do it for the benefits, but are afraid for whatever reason that it is exclusive to a certain religion and you have to be in a religion to do it, you have no right to do it, worry not, because meditation is like anything, it's just like a habit. You can incorporate it in your daily routine for the enormous loads of benefits it has. Now, meditation in Buddhism is used as a method to still the mind. It involves the body and the mind. For Buddhists, this is particularly important as they want to avoid what they call duality, and so their way of meditating must involve the body and the mind as a single entity. In the most general definition, meditation is a way of taking control of the mind so that it becomes peaceful and focused and the meditator becomes more aware. We have been discussing why Buddhists meditate, but I cannot stress enough how important it is for you to meditate as well. Meditation has a lot of benefits, and we are going to be going over them because meditation is an excellent tool that is literally going to change your life. Start with 10 minutes a day, then increase the time every day. If you're really worried about the time, like, oh, how long should I do this for? Generally, 30 minutes is a healthy dose. And however, if you have a lot of free time on your hands, you could try going for an hour, but that would be overkill. So, quickly going over the benefits of meditation. Meditation helps you in gaining a new perspective on a stressful situation, building skills to manage your stress, increasing self awareness, focusing on the present, reducing negative emotions, increasing imagination and creativity, increasing patience and tolerance, lowering and resting the heart rate, lowering resting blood pressure, improving sleep quality. I would like to emphasize that I am not a medical professional. If you have some of these problems and you think meditation can solve it on its own, please consult your doctor first. With that out of the way, meditation might also be useful if you have a medical condition, especially one that might get worsened by stress. With that in mind, some research suggests that meditation may help people manage symptoms of conditions such as anxiety, asthma, cancer, chronic pain, depression, heart disease, high blood pressure, irritable one that might get worsened by stress. With that in mind, some research suggests that meditation may help people manage symptoms of conditions such as anxiety, asthma, cancer, chronic pain, depression, heart disease, high blood pressure, irritable bowel syndrome, sleep problems, and tension headaches. However, yeah, as stated before, please be sure to talk to your doctor and your healthcare provider about the pros and cons of using meditation if you have any of these conditions or other health problems. In some rare cases, meditation might actually worsen symptoms associated with certain mental health conditions. There are a lot of meditation techniques, however. This is generally what meditation is used for, calming the mind and reducing stress and anxiety. Meditation techniques are going to be discussed in future episodes, and we're going to be delving deeper into them, so stay tuned for that. With meditation fully explained in Buddhism, it is time to get into chanting. Now, it is important to understand that chanting is very common in any religion. Buddhism is no exception in this regard. However, the aim and purpose of chanting is different from one religion to another, and Buddhism is unique in that. It does not consider chanting to be a prayer of some sort. When a Buddhist does chanting, he is not asking for someone to save him from evil, nor is he hoping to be given a place in the heavens. No, as a result, after he dies, no. Instead, through chanting, he may be learning, teaching, philosophizing, or rememorizing the discourse. Now, why do Buddhists chant? In the olden days, before there were sufficient support materials for studying like books, translations, and computers, Buddhists had to memorize to learn a discourse. After they had learned it, they would chant it every day to protect it and hand it down to future generations. It was more of a form of not forgetting what had been taught and allowing more generations to have access to the Buddhist techniques, which goes to show how influential the Buddhist teachings were, and more importantly, how grateful Buddhist monks were for getting the chance to get on the right path. Chanting began as a form of maintaining important techniques. However, its importance has risen since it was recognized as a traditional means for preparing the mind for meditation, especially as a part of a formal practice. The chants introduce meaning and purpose into one's life and are often communal. Anyone, anywhere can sense connectedness with the Buddhist path. Chanting settles the mind to enter meditation or to feel part of a larger group in a temple. You might be also wondering what this quote purpose or meaning is. Actually, chanting serves various purposes in Buddhism, including developing concentration. Chanting allows practitioners to focus their minds on the present moment, enhancing concentration and mindfulness. It also helps in cultivating positive qualities, where chanting sacred texts or mantras can help cultivate compassion, loving kindness, equanimity, and other positive qualities. Then we have commemorating the Buddha and teachings as previously stated. Chanting can be a way to express reverence, gratitude, and respect for the Buddha, his teachings, Dharma, and the monastic community, which is the Sangha. It could also act as a form of meditation. Chanting can serve as a form of meditation where the repetitive sounds, rhythms, and vibrations of the chants help calm the mind and promote inner peace and insight. That's why some monks say the very famous Om when they meditate. It helps with mindfulness as well as being its own form of meditation. Now, Buddhism encompasses various traditions that may have different types of chanting, but some common forms include the sutra chanting, which is literally just reciting sutras, which are canonical teachings attributed to the Buddha. This may involve individual or group chanting. The sutras are the quote words of the Buddha and were originally chanted as a means of remembering the spoken teachings of the historical Buddha. Then we have mantra chanting, which is the repetition of specific phrases or syllables believed to possess spiritual power and significance. Mantras such as the Om Mani Padme Hum, I totally butchered that, are commonly chanted. Devotional chanting, chanting in praise or devotion to the Buddha or other enlightened beings. This often includes reciting their names, qualities, or virtues. Then we have repentance chanting, which is chanting to express remorse for past wrongdoings or to purify negative karma. Now that you know what the type of chanting are, you might be wondering what are some of the benefits it carries. Why do people do it? Why should I do it? Chanting in Buddhism carries numerous benefits as it provides enhanced mindfulness and concentration, cultivation of positive qualities like compassion, loving kindness, and equanimity, deepening understanding of the Buddhist teaching, purification of negative karma and remorse for past actions, inspiration and motivation for spiritual practice, and connection to the Buddhist community and lineage. Contrary to what you might think, chanting isn't limited to Buddhist monks as it has numerous benefits for the normal person as well. So if you're someone who just happens to come across this practice, for the normal person, chanting can actually lead to decreased negative mood, which leads to increased positive mood, improved focus, and altruism, which is the unselfish concern for other people, which is doing things out of the desire to help, not because you feel obligated to out of duty, loyalty, or religious reasons. You just do it because you want to do it. It helps boost self awareness and it generates a greater sense of calm. It also leads to increased social connection when done in a group setting. So I have personally tried this before. Now remember, this is the most optimal you can get. So if you find yourself unable to do exactly as I'm going to say, don't worry, you don't have to perfect it. You just have to be good enough. Now, before I say it, I would really, really, really like to emphasize for the perfectionists out there that this is the most optimal it can get. It's not the base of what should be done. So with that out of the way, first off, you have to create the environment, create a calm, quiet environment free from distractions, preferably in a shrine or an altar with an image of the Buddha or some sacred objects. It can be helpful in setting the atmosphere. Now, I just did it in my bedroom, which is okay as well. Moving on, for the posture, you're going to want to sit comfortably in a cross-legged position, or if not possible, sit on a chair with an erect spine. Alternatively, chanting can also be done while walking mindfully. I just sat in a meditation pause. For the breathing, begin by taking a few deep breaths to calm the mind and body, establishing a relaxed rhythm. In case you find yourself worried about the pacing and pronunciation, chants are typically recited slow and steady pace with clear pronunciation. If unsure about the pronunciation, seek guidance from experienced practitioners or teachers. As for mindful awareness, be fully present and immersed in the sounds and the vibrations of the chant. Maintain awareness of the meaning and intention behind the words, fostering qualities like focus, gratitude, compassion, and or repentance. How long should you do this for? Chanting sessions can be as short as a few minutes or extended to hours, depending on personal preference and available time. As I mentioned earlier, I have personally tried chanting the other day and it's a whole different world. So I did it in my bedroom against the wall in a sitting meditative pose, the one you usually use to meditate. It was practically meditation except for the Om sound, which is the chant I decided to use. It was the most simple. At first, you can tell the difference between normal meditation and chanted meditation, which is the term I have come up with for this type of meditation. You immediately get centered, you get focused. The Om acts as a barrier between you and your thoughts, so you have nothing to listen to except for the sounds you are making. The vibration really helps you there. Eventually, you feel your body and the quote you separate, which is a really nice feeling to have. Granted, I didn't do it for the feeling alone, but it's a good thing that it is really worth mentioning. It is so good that it is worth mentioning. After I was done with the chanted meditation, I felt a weird sense of calm, peace, like everything was just okay. I felt peaceful, I felt gratitude, I felt a weird sense of compassion as well. I couldn't put my finger on it. I definitely recommend that you incorporate this in your daily routine, as I have personally found it to be a life changing practice that can skyrocket your performance as well as sanity. Now, before diving into Buddhist philosophy, I would like to note that there are certain concepts that you must be familiar with, so I'll give you a quick overview on them. First off, karma. Now, karma refers to the law of cause and effect. It suggests our actions, intentions, and thoughts create certain consequences in this life or in future lives. It is believed that every action, whether physical, verbal, or mental, generates karma. Then that karma can be either positive, negative, or neutral. Positive karma leads to favorable circumstances and happiness. Negative karma leads to suffering and difficulties, and neutral karma creates neutral experiences. The concept is pretty simple and straightforward. If you do a good thing, you get good results. You do bad things, you get bad results. You might not get the results in this particular life, but you'll get them, don't worry. You might have noticed I said in this life or future lives. The reason for this is the second concept, which is reincarnation and rebirth. Now, rebirth, also known as reincarnation rebirth, is the belief that after death, an individual's consciousness is reborn into a new body in a subsequent life. According to this belief, the cycle of rebirth continues until one attains liberation, which is called nirvana, following the Eightfold Path and by realizing the ultimate truth of existence and putting an end to the cycle of birth and death and cutting off the 12 link chain. This is only the tip of the iceberg for the concepts in Buddhist philosophy. Some key concepts and techniques in Buddhist philosophy include the no self. Now, I'd like to start this one off by telling you a story. So, there is a young reporter who is at an airport. He spots a Buddhist monk, so he decides to interview him. The young reporter asks the monk, "What would you say is the biggest problem? Is it violence, global warming, greed, lust perhaps?" The monk smiles and says, "Well, let me ask you this. First, who are you?" The young man looks confused. He says, "I'm a reporter." The monk says, "No, no, that is your profession. Who are you?" The young man looks even more confused and he just stays silent for a moment. Then he says, "Well, I'm John Smith." He says, "No, that is your name. Who are you?" The reporter thinks for a moment. Then he says, "I'm a human." He says, the monk says, "No, that is your species. Who are you?" The reporter thinks for another moment and he says, "I do not know who I am." The monk smiled and said, "That is the world's biggest problem." Now, Buddhism challenges the notion of a permanent, independent, and inherently existing self, teaches that there is no fixed and unchanging essence or soul within individuals or phenomena. You are not the body, you are not the mind, not the feeling, not the consciousness. However, it is not true to say that you do not exist, because you do. This prompts us to ask the idea of a self. What is that? What does it mean? So basically, the idea of a self is the sense of I that you have. It is the sense of identity, of being someone specific. Now, what does it mean to have an identity? To have an identity, it is essentially to have some sort of continuity from one point to a later point. The sense of I based on the idea of identity. If you take away the sense of I, then the sense of identity cannot exist anymore. The paradox of the ship of Theseus explains this identity thing really, really well. So imagine you have a ship, and over the years you have been endlessly repairing the ship. Then you get to a point where all of the ship's parts, every single screw has been replaced. Nothing from the original ship stayed on it anymore, not even a screw. Down to a screw. When you have changed everything, is it the same ship? This thought experiment raises the question of whether an object that has had all of its components replaced remains fundamentally the same object. If someone were to look at a before and after picture of the ship of Theseus, for example, they would say this is not the same ship anymore, it is completely different. This is what Buddhists mean by something not having an identity. There is nothing that moves along with this ship. There is no identity, no continuity, nothing similar between what was there before and after. Now, this applies to a human being as well. If there is no identity, then the things are continually changing. And there comes a point where nothing of what was originally there anymore is there anymore, like in the ship of Theseus. Now, it is said that when you fully understand this, when you fully understand the idea of non-self, nothing passes from one point to another. When we analyze the psyche of a human being, there is nothing that is unchanging. There's no identity that goes on. For example, 20-year-old you is not going to hold the same identity as 10-year-old you. We know that in order to get a better understanding, a better view of human beings, we actually have to go back. We have to go back to the five aggregates. For those of you who don't remember them, the five aggregates are, very briefly, form, consciousness, mental formation, cognition, and feeling. The feeling of I is like a magic trick that only appears real when you are not looking closely at it. If you do look closely at it, you will find that nothing in your experience can be a self. That there is just a very elaborate symphony of the five aggregates. Similar to an RGB screen, let's say you're watching a movie when you think you're looking at a person, for example, Will Smith. At first glance, you might think that you're seeing the actual Will Smith. However, when you think of what you are seeing on the screen, what is on the screen is simply a grouping of frames which are made up of pixels, and each pixel is a combination of three colors only: red, blue, and green. All of these images, emotions, that the movie gives you, it's all just a result of the careful choreography of these three components only. There is no Will Smith in front of you, it's just the clever patterns of red, greens, and blues that fools you into thinking you are seeing Will Smith. So just like the RGB screen, the illusion of I appears from a very clever pattern of the five aggregates, which are again form, consciousness, mental formation, cognition, and feeling. I would like you to ask yourself, can you find anything within your own experience that finds itself out of these five aggregates? Now this prompts an even larger question: who are you? Who feels your feelings? Who desires your desires? Who is the thinker of your thoughts? Now, the answer at first might seem very obvious and clear. You might say, it is me, it is I. However, let's backtrack for a moment. So, just like an RGB screen, humans are a clever pattern of the five aggregates. These aggregates, like anything in the world, are changing constantly. When these aggregates come together, the unenlightened say a person is born. When they fall apart, the unenlightened say a person has died. And when the aggregates separate and come back, forming a different pattern, the unenlightened say a person has been reincarnated. However, the Buddha tells us that there is no person to be found anywhere. The Buddha understands that we need terms like person and self in order to orient ourselves in this world. So, by conventional terms, 10-year-old you is the same person as 50-year-old you. However, in the ultimate truth, there is no you, there is no me, there is no anyone. We are all a different pattern of the five aggregates flowing in time. We are constantly falling apart and coming back together, forming different patterns. Ultimately, we are comparable to streams of water flowing in different ways. The aggregates fall into a terrible misconception that they are a person, mainly because the pattern of our five aggregates are so complex, and since the ordinary human mind is so distracted. The Buddha says that every model of the self you can have is going to be a mistaken view and is only grasping at one of the five aggregates. For example, you say the self dies with the physical body, you are grasping at form. You say the self that is inside you, which feels either good or bad, you're grasping at feeling. You say, I think, therefore I am, you are grasping at cognition. Those of you who say, I am my choices and free will, you grasp at mental formation. Those of you who see yourself as the pure awareness, you grasp at the aggregate of consciousness. None of these can be the self. You can't make your body healthy simply by wishing to do so, nor can you control your thoughts. You can't even control your feelings. The five aggregates change based on external causes, so none of the aggregates can be the self. Moreover, the aggregates are not permanent. They cannot be the self because they are subject to change. One day you feel happy, the other day you feel sad. One day you feel happy, the other day you feel sad. And just like feeling, every aggregate is subject to change. Things are changing all the time. Life is practically a collection of experiences. You get cheated on, you celebrate your birthday, you feel happy about this one thing, then you feel sad about another. There is no solid identity to anything. There is nothing there which goes across those experiences, which is always unchanging and always the same. So the sense of I doesn't really have a foundation. The idea of the sense of I does not really have a foundation that can be truly experienced through meditation. When you first start with meditation, perhaps you are less restless or sleepy. So as you go into deeper into meditation, your focus on the breath, everything around you starts to slowly fade away. And all of your emotions, and sometimes attachments to certain scenarios, they just fade away. Everything becomes so simple. You become able to see more of the subtle aspect of the things you have previously taken to be yourself, and only when these ideas become extremely subtle, extremely simple, it is possible to fully understand what the idea of non-self means. You start to see it to the core, then you actually begin to understand what that change is just absolute. There is no identity that moves across from A to B, and the sense of I, that which you are holding on to, is nothing more than an illusion. As a result, you get this sense of freedom and peace. You understand that there is nothing that's yours, there is nothing that you can control. Things move and change according to their own cause, and all we can do is stand back and allow them to just be. Because you are not in charge, you don't try to control what you can't control, you get this sense of peace and freedom. The idea of non-self is practically seeing that there is no identity, ground, or foundation for this feeling of I that we have there. The sense of I is based on identity, something that is going across. It's a false thing. When you see delusion, happiness arises as a consequence. Right then and there, you have ended suffering that arises from identifying too strongly with the sense of self. Now, you might be wondering what identifying too strongly with the sense of self even means. It practically means that everything is always changing. Time and change takes everything away from us that we think belongs to us, whether that be a car, a house, finances, loved ones, and eventually our very own lives. Now we think how much suffering there is in one's life. The one who says, this is me, this is mine, this is myself, this is my body, my mind, my car, my wealth, mine, right before losing it all, bit by bit, very slowly. This person has identified with everything they have accumulated through believing statements like, I am wealthy, my car, and ultimately failed to see that despite the car belonging to them, if we use conventional terms, ultimately nothing is actually theirs. The whole idea of an individual self is just an illusion. I would like to end this segment of non-self with a very powerful quote that nicely summarizes this idea. Whatever thoughts you have about yourself aren't who and what you are. Moving on, we have dependent origination, which is another term used to describe the 12-link chain. I'm going to briefly summarize them because I do believe that they are a very important concept, and it has been life-changing actually, just learning about them. Okay, so first of all, you have ignorance, mental formation, consciousness, name and form, six senses, contact, feeling, craving, grasping, becoming, birth, aging, and death. Moving on to arguably one of the most important concepts in Buddhism as a whole, emptiness. Now, emptiness in Buddhism. I like to start this off with a quote. It goes very hard. It is because it is empty of self and of what belongs to the self that it is said to empty is the world. Now, contrary to popular belief, emptiness does not mean nothingness. It does not mean that a self or something belongs to the self is nowhere to be found, but rather that things arise dependently and lack independent existence. Conscious experience is dependent on the sense of objects and sense organs. Consciousness arises when the sense organs come into contact with the sense objects. Take in music, for example. Let's say a musician is playing their instrument. In this case, the instrument is the sense object. So when a musician plays their musical instrument, you hear the music through your ears, which are the sense organs in this case. Music is produced, you hear it, thus consciousness arises, which in this case, the music itself. Here you say, I hear the music, but this phenomenon of hearing the music is a result of a chain of causes and conditions, like a domino effect called dependent arising. First, a brief introduction. Dependent arising means that everything, whether mental or physical, exists and occurs because of the presence of certain conditions. Everything is dependent on other things. So, for example, an apple seed and an apple tree. Both are dependent on one another. In order for the apple tree to exist, the apple seed must exist. And disclaimer, we are not talking about a specific apple tree or seed. Generally, in order for something such as an apple tree to exist, something by the name of an apple seed must exist for the apple tree to exist. So it's general, everything is general. The apple seeds help the apple trees live on, and vice versa. Without the apple seeds, there wouldn't be any apple trees. And without apple trees, we wouldn't have apple seeds. So basically, in order for any factor to come into existence, its condition, A, let's just refer to the condition as A, must exist or be operative. Now, B arises through the contribution of its condition. Now, A, as discussed in our previous example, an apple tree exists in dependence on the apple seeds. If there is an apple seed, there is an apple tree. That apple tree can come into existence. If an apple seed comes into being, the tree can come into being. Just a quick disclaimer, we are going to be referring to the apple seeds as A and the apple tree as B. So when A, the condition for the occurrence of B, does not exist, then the phenomena B will not exist. But as B exists on dependence on A, then with the absence of A, B will not occur. If A ceases, then B will cease. If there is no apple seed, there is no apple tree, and if the seed is destroyed, then there can be no growth of an apple tree, for the tree demands the seed. And the apple, for example, does not arise only from the seed, while the seed is the main condition. It also requires soil, water, sunshine, fertilizer, etc. The apple tree, in turn, has many effects. It gives rise to many apples, and those many apples each contain many seeds. And each of these seeds, in turn, can become a source for another apple tree, which will give rise to more apples. Now, this whole complex interlocking web of events has no first cause. Usually, we think that the chain of cause and effect needs a first cause, but for Buddhism, there is no original beginning. The succession of causes and conditions has been occurring without any conceivable beginning, without any boundaries or limits. In other words, things just are. When there is this, that comes to be. When the arising of this, that arises. When there is not no this does not exist, that does not come to be. With the cessation of this, that ceases. Now, back to our music example, everything is dependent on one another. In this chain reaction, there is nothing to attribute to a self. A self isn't even required for all of this to occur. The Buddha says the ear is empty, or a self, or anything pertaining to a self. Sounds, ear, consciousness, the ear contact are empty of a self, and anything applicable to a self. So there is no you who is experiencing this experience. There is no experiencer of this experience. There is only an endless cycle of causes and conditions stretching all throughout time. And if you haven't guessed, it's samsara, the endless cycle of suffering. It is sustained by what we want, our attraction to what we like, and our avoidance of what we don't like. It is all up to the self. However, our feeling of self doesn't correspond to anything in reality. Another major point in emptiness is that nothing inherently exists on its own. The entire world around us is relegated to the status of mere secondary existence, apart from the property particulars which are primary existence. For example, the audio that you are listening to does not exist on its own. It is a combination of my voice and the script that I've written. This video could not appear in your existence without the platform you are viewing it on, the microphone I'm using to record this, and the speakers on your device which allow you to listen to my voice. They are not primary existence. This video wouldn't exist without your internet connection either. It wouldn't exist without the people who install your internet connection and maintain it. You couldn't experience this video if you didn't have the ears to hear it or the eyes to see it, which are the outcomes of multiple causes and conditions. Your parents quite literally making you all of the bundles of experiences that led to their love, how they met, keeps going back and back and back and back with every generation. So evolution and the Big Bang. The list of causes and conditions could go on forever. What you are experiencing now as an individual phenomenon, it just looks like it. It is not an individual phenomenon, it just looks like it. In reality, it is far from it. Its existence isn't a primary existence. In fact, you could go as far as to say that the whole world and its history have conspired for this video to exist. However, this isn't a unique example. Take a look at your couch. That too has a very long list of phenomena which have probably contributed for its existence. Let's say the animals that had to be slaughtered to get the leather, the tree that had to be chopped down to provide the wood, the hunter who hunted the animals, the life of the hunter, what led him to become a hunter, how he got his gun, who made the gun, the life of the person who made the gun, and it just goes back and back and back and back and back. And that's not even getting into the lives and the very specifics of every single contributing factor. At this point, you might be wondering how this relates to emptiness. If you do, I did too. I went back to the definition of emptiness in Buddhism, and when we say that things are empty, we mean that they lack independent existence outside of these changing contexts. Every person, place, and thing is entirely dependent on another person and other things, which are necessary conditions for its existence. Now, for anyone struggling to keep up with this might be just too much information at once. Basically, the self is empty because it doesn't have a fixed identity. There isn't such a thing as a self. Nothing you experience can be a self. There is just a very elaborate symphony of the five aggregates. Objects are empty of essence because they cannot be existing individually on their own, and the phenomena that they are dependent on are practically endless. So the self is empty and the object is empty. This begs the question, is the experience empty as well? I mean, you can question literally everything about your experience, but the one thing you can't deny is that something is happening. Now, according to the Yogacarans, sorry I butchered that, emptiness is said to be the ultimate non-existence of the things we see. In other words, the Yogacarans assert that reality is empty of duality but not empty of existence. Now, in order to get a better understanding, let's do a little exercise. This will actually blow your mind. So take anything in your room. In my case, it's a pillow. So there is me as the subject, and there is the pillow as the object. Then we have the experience of seeing the pillow. Obviously, I cannot experience seeing the pillow if the pillow was not here. Without the object, I cannot experience said object. Here's where things get interesting though. If I were not seeing the pillow, would it exist? Now, the natural answer is yes, of course it will exist. Objects around me don't just disappear every time I look away from them. However, how would this pillow exist if I were not seeing it right now? What evidence do I have to provide that this pillow exists? You may answer saying, pillows exist all over the world. If you aren't convinced, you can just find countless Google images of pillows on Google. I mean, yes, but have you seen pillows in the past? Seeing the pillow is proof of its existence. In other words, our experience is based upon which existence is confirmed. Here's another question. Now, can you imagine an object, let's say a pillow, without seeing it? Here you might say, yes, I am doing that right now. I can see it in my mind/imagination. But you are still seeing it. The moment you imagine the pillow, you see it. Now, through meditation combined with philosophical genius, the Yogacharans have discovered what we call the objects of experience, which are really inseparable from what we call experience. If you were both looking at the pillow and you close your eyes, for example, you sort of end your experience of looking at the pillow. You are not experiencing the pillow. Your experience cannot occur if you aren't experiencing it. To see something, you have to see it. You as an experiencer and the experience itself are completely codependent on each other in your existence. So there is no boundaries between you and you seeing the pillow. There are also no boundaries between the pillow and you seeing it as well. This means that you, the pillow, and you seeing the pillow are different names for the same thing observed at different angles. And what is that thing? Experience. To the Yogacharans, all that exists is experience. Reality is experience in and of itself. It is both which experiences and which is experienced by itself. Yogacara philosophy is rooted in insight and gained through meditations. It's very difficult to wrap your head around this. Now, you might be wondering, okay, cool to know all of this stuff. It is very cool and be aware of it. Now, how can it help me? Well, emptiness offers a path of liberation from suffering by freeing us from attachments to fixed views, concepts, and perceptions. Our suffering often arises from clinging to ideas of identity, possessions, and desires. Now, by realizing the emptiness of these constructs, we can let go of attachment and find freedom from suffering. Embracing emptiness helps us to see that our expectations, cravings, and attachments are transient and illusory, allowing us to cultivate some sense of equanimity. Moreover, emptiness represents the ultimate reality, a profound understanding of the true nature of existence. Through rigorous study, meditation, and contemplation, practitioners can penetrate the veils of delusion and directly experience the emptiness of all phenomena. This realization that is derived from experience brings wisdom and insight into the ever-changing and interconnected nature of reality, leading to liberation from suffering and the attainment of enlightenment. It is also important to note that grasping at the true depth of emptiness is a lifelong journey for practitioners. It requires diligent study, deep meditation, and guidance from experienced teachers to peel away layers of confusion and insightfully penetrate the profound truth of emptiness. Now, I found this quote that nicely summarizes emptiness. Form is emptiness, and emptiness is form. Everything in the universe is interconnected, and that all things are fundamentally empty of inherent existence. Everything is just empty, dude. Moving on, there's something that's actually a key concept in helping us achieve nirvana, and I haven't discussed it so far, and that is the three marks of existence. Each of the three marks of existence has something unique to teach, starting off with anicca, which means impermanence. This means that everything is in constant state of flux. Buddhism states that all physical and mental events come into being and dissolve. We have a really bad tendency to go through life attaching to ourselves to ideas, doctrines, philosophies, and more materialistic things like expensive cars and even people. When things change, however, you aren't friends with that person anymore, or you don't have that car anymore, you feel horrible about the fact that it's not there as much as you wouldn't like to admit it. Some part of you did hope that it would last forever, and you try to ensure that it does. However, everything is impermanent, everything will either break or die at some point, and you just have to accept that and live life knowing that any moment you could lose everything you have. Whenever you face something different, a person doesn't like you anymore, your car breaks down, it's not just what it used to be. Try to remind yourself this has changed. It would be foolish of me to expect this to remain in the same condition forever. This helps teach gratitude in a weird way. However, it's not all dark and gloomy because everything is impermanent. We ourselves can change. We can let go of fears, and disappointment, and regret. Now, next up is our old friend dukkha. We haven't talked about him in a while, which refers to dissatisfaction. We have gone over this in the First Noble Truth. Life is dukkha, life is dissatisfaction. We have gone over this in detail in the First Noble Truth. However, for the sake of this episode, we're just going to go back to it. So dukkha, suffering, dissatisfaction, everything is dissatisfaction. Even pleasurable things are just a delayed, like happiness. They're just a delayed form of dissatisfaction. So everything is just dukkha. And lastly, we have anara, which is the non-self, which is the absence of a permanent enduring self or ego within the individuals. The non-existence of a fixed self implies that there is no solid, unchanging essence to cling to, leading to freedom and liberation from attachment and suffering. If you are looking to get into Buddhism, I strongly believe that you need to listen to the story of the Zen master and the teacup. So it's a very short story. Once, a long time ago, there was a wise Zen master. People from far and near would seek his counsel and ask for his wisdom. Many would come and ask him to teach them, enlighten them in a way of Zen. He seldom turned anyone away. One day, an important man used to command and obedience came to visit the master. He said, I have come to ask you to teach me about Zen. Open my mind to enlightenment. The tone of the important man's voice was one of a tone that a person was used to getting what they want. So the Zen master smiled and said they should discuss this over a cup of tea. Now, when the tea was served, the master poured his visitor a cup, and he poured and poured and poured until the tea rose to the rim and began to spill over the table and finally onto the robes of the wealthy man. Finally, the visitor shouted, Enough! You are spilling the tea all over. Can't you see the cup is full? The master stopped pouring and smiled at his guest. He said, You are like this teacup, so full that nothing more can be added. How am I supposed to teach you Zen if you don't empty your cup first? Come back to me when your cup is empty. Come back to me with an empty mind. Now, if you're looking to delve deeper and practice Buddhism, I strongly suggest that you empty your teacup first. Ladies and gentlemen, this marks the end of today's podcast episode. I would like to thank you for tuning into today's episode on Buddhism. If you enjoyed this episode, make sure to support us by leaving a like and subscribing. See you next time. Goodbye.